Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to rise and debate for the second time on Bill C-21 and speak about changes to the Customs Act. And I'm going to premise my remarks upon the fact that many people in this House of Commons change over time. Sometimes the change is dramatic. I've highlighted the dramatic change of the Deputy House Leader of the Liberals, my friend from Winnipeg, who speaks in this House far more than everyone else. So he's just a treasure trove of contrary positions on a whole range of issues, Mr. Speaker, particularly how hurt personally he was during the Conservative government, whether there was ever an omnibus bill or the use of time allocation. Now he organizes the use of time allocation for his House Leader, Mr. Speaker. There's also some ironies in looking at the longtime member from Saskatchewan, who's now our Minister of Public Safety, because he has been on both sides of every issue, Mr. Speaker, and he's doing so wonderfully today. He gave a speech that extolled the virtues of a common entry-exit system with respect to the United States and tracking exit information of Canadians for a variety of reasons, and he talked about how good those reasons were. But what did he say about it in 2011? Because the entry-exit issue has been part of the Beyond the Border initiative that the Conservative government worked with President Obama for many years, trying to make sure that goods were delivered faster, there was exchange of workers across the border, and that security protocols were respected. What did he say in February 2011? That minister who's now pushing this rapidly through the House, he said, quote, "If we have a common entry and common exit system, does it not follow that Canada no longer has sovereign Canadian control over immigration and refugees? Canadians need to know that is at risk," end quote. Mr. Speaker, it's ironic in 2018 to hear that minister talk about sovereign Canadian control over our border, Mr. Speaker, when his press conference earlier this week in Quebec with several other members of Cabinet shows that their inaction and incompetence has essentially surrendered any sovereign border controls in this country, Mr. Speaker. Due to inaction, due to the desire to keep their centre-left coalition alive, Mr. Speaker, they won't even do the basic enforcement of border rules and regulations, Mr. Speaker. It's astonishing. When the Conservatives were exploring entry-exit visa or system, it was a high priority for our American friends under the Obama administration. The minister expressed concern about it at the time, and now he's driving it through. What else did he say about this, Mr. Speaker, in February 2011? He conceded in many ways that if Canada, under the Conservatives, were to go to a common entry-exit system information sharing with the United States, that it only should be done under specific circumstances, Mr. Speaker. He said this, quote, "Could the Prime Minister at least guarantee minimum gains for Canada?" End quote, Mr. Speaker. So what the minister was saying at the time was that if Canada was to relent to the American request for the sharing of entry and exit information across our border, we should at least extract something in return. What is going to be the guaranteed minimum gains for Canada, Mr. Speaker? That's what he asked for in opposition. And in fact, why did the Conservative government not complete entry and exit information sharing with the American administration? We were fighting for Canadian jobs related to the Keystone XL pipeline, Mr. Speaker. We wanted a gain. We wanted to be treated as a mature partner in the Canada-US relationship. So we were fighting for that gain. So we didn't rush through a bill like C-21, Mr. Speaker. What has Canada achieved under the US-Canada relationship under this Liberal government, Mr. Speaker? What's the minimum gain we're getting now for this entry-exit sharing, Mr. Speaker? Nothing. In fact, NAFTA is at risk. Our steel and aluminum exports are at risk, Mr. Speaker. We're not even consulted on decisions of a security nature made by the United States, Mr. Speaker, and the government can't even get their answers straight on whether they're talking to the Americans about fixing the gap in the Safe Third Country Agreement, Mr. Speaker. That minister suggests they are talking. The immigration minister.
We have a point of order from the member for Vancouver East.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, you know, we're debating Bill C-21. The member himself has highlighted that and knows that, and now he's talking about something else entirely not related to Bill C-21. Actually, I was, and Mr. Speaker, I was listening quite intently, and frankly, it is not on topic, and I leave that up to you in your capable hands, Mr. Speaker.
Well, once again, as I'd mentioned earlier, I leave it to the members. I'm sure no one elected anyone incompetent or anyone who can't put together an argument. So I'm going to trust the ability of the individual members to come back to the issue, and I'm sure the honourable member will come back to the issue that we're discussing, and he's just trying to make a point in grabbing facts and figures to bring forward. I'll leave it to his discretion, and hopefully we'll be debating the issue at hand. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, through you to that member, I would recommend to her to use research as opposed to anger in her interventions here in the House. I'm talking about the minister who just gave a speech and was questioning her in her questions and comments, Mr. Speaker, on his views on C-20.
Mr. Speaker, I take offense to the comment the members made about me. When I raised the issue, yes, I'm passionate about the issue, and so are many other members in this House who expressed their point of view. And I take offense for the fact that he has specifically highlighted my passion on this issue as somehow, for his interpretation, for it to be anger. And I ask the member to withdraw that comment.
Well, I will leave it to the individual member, but I believe that was an observation of his. The honourable member. That was more of a debate than anything else.
The honourable member is basically underscoring my point. My questions relate to the minister, when he was in opposition, opposed this very type of legislation, Mr. Speaker. He opposed the common entry and exit system that is at the underpinnings of C-21 for people that want to delve into what's in the legislation. That minister who spoke promoting the bill in 2011 opposed it for several reasons. He said it would give up our sovereign control of our immigration and refugee system. I'm suggesting it did not. He said it did at the time, Mr. Speaker. He also then said if Canada is to make an agreement acceding to this request by the Americans to share entry and exit information, that we should extract gains for our country, our national interest in the process, Mr. Speaker. We have not secured gains. This is a Customs Act decision related to travel of our citizens and our residents between our country and the United States, the country we travel to the most, including in British Columbia, including in my province of Ontario, Mr. Speaker. So we should be very clear that if we're going to streamline that with the Americans, that we receive in return respect and things that help our national interests. We are not receiving that, Mr. Speaker, in return for C-21. NAFTA is at risk. The steel workers I met with this week, Mr. Speaker, that normally support the NDP would probably be shocked that it's the Conservatives standing up for them in this House, Mr. Speaker. Our aluminum exports. When the minister asked that Canada get gains for giving the type of power C-21 give, I'd like to see what Canada has secured in return, Mr. Speaker, because it looks like the Canada-US relationship is eroding, Mr. Speaker. And we are imposing more exit requirements on Canadians traveling back and forth across the Canada-US border, Mr. Speaker, at a time that government is ignoring the basic laws that require people to report to a CBSA border check, Mr. Speaker. So all of these issues are deeply related, including Bill C-23, which is a companion piece of legislation to Bill C-21. I've spoken on both bills at length, Mr. Speaker. The changes to pre-clearance should also concern Canadians, because now information will be shared when they leave and go, and the minister alluded to the fact that benefits are tied to these. So it's clear they're going to be going after Canadians for tax purposes, for eligibility for a series of benefits and sharing that information with the United States, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, changes to Section 94 of the Act, if people want to delve into looking at what those sections provide, now gives border officials upon exit the ability to ask any question of a Canadian going down for a holiday or a business meeting in the United States, Mr. Speaker. I've already told how the Liberal government has failed by not, as part of these discussions on entry and exit, had the American Immigration and Custom Enforcement, the ICE office, the equivalent of the CBSA in the United States, they haven't even been able to get an assurance that ICE will remove the marijuana question from their screening questions. So what this bill means, Mr. Speaker, is that there's going to be any question possible asked by CBSA officials for a Canadian leaving, and we will be sharing that information on Canadians with the United States, yet we're legalizing marijuana and they haven't even gotten assurance from the Americans that their border agents, their ICE agents, won't ask Canadians questions about marijuana use, whether medicinal or legal eventually, Mr. Speaker. Why that should concern people? It can lead to a ban to travel in the United States and could impact someone's employment, Mr. Speaker. So Bill C-21 and Bill C-23 are together and are the border package presented by this government. There's nothing to actually solidify and secure our immigration and refugee and our asylum claim process, Mr. Speaker. And I've said countless times, the best way to make sure we keep a high level of Canadian confidence in our system, from the people that are in the queue now to the people that are looking at coming to Canada through our refugee system or through our immigration system, is that it runs by a rules-based fair process. That's fair. We're a rules-based country, Mr. Speaker. And while we're looking at that, the minister is passing this bill, yet not able to get any new assurances with respect to the Safe Third Country Act, Mr. Speaker. I would note that that minister, referring back to the comments I said he made in 2011, that member was also a member of the Chrétien government in 2002, which negotiated the Safe Third Country Act with the Americans. So what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is John Manley, with Tom Ridge as the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary at the time, negotiated the Safe Third Country Agreement with respect to asylum claims and seeking asylum, meaning the first country you go to, if you're fleeing persecution, you claim asylum, and that would be recognized. So if it was Canada, it would be Canada. If it was the United States, it would be the United States. And by circumventing proper border checks, whether you call it an irregular asylum claimant, that irregular asylum claimant is also breaking the law by crossing the border, Mr. Speaker. So the system provided for that. And what did the Liberal minister at the time, that was a colleague of the Minister of Public Safety, say? He actually said the Safe Third Country Agreement, which my friend in the NDP wants to toss out or set aside or temporarily suspend, the Safe Third Country Agreement was the Liberal government at the time's response to UN rules with respect to refugees and the Charter of Rights. In fact, those two documents John Manley referred to in the House of Commons on May 7, 2002, when he said this: both of these, referring to Convention on Refugees and the Charter of Rights, Mr. Speaker, both of these drove us to the conclusion that it would be necessary to negotiate a Safe Third Country Agreement. End quote, Mr. Speaker. So, the last major border agreement with the United States was by John Manley. The Minister of Public Safety was in cabinet with him. And the next subsequent set of border arrangements with the United States was this minister, C-21 and C-23, actually giving American customs agents the ability to search Canadians on Canadian soil, Mr. Speaker. Yet they won't even touch the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. So, Canadians should be concerned, Mr. Speaker. I raise this because there's been a lack of attention to the border, to a rules-based system with respect to asylum claims and immigration. There's been a risk that our border will become thick for commercial transit, Mr. Speaker. That is a real risk for just-in-time manufacturing, particularly for the auto industry that touches my riding, touches Windsor, Oakville. If the border thickens and goods are slowed and people are slowed, Mr. Speaker, we will lose jobs and investment in Canada. And right now, that minister in 2011, when the Conservatives looked at the Beyond the Border initiative with this entry-exit piece to it, Mr. Speaker, he said, you better get something for Canada out of this, Mr. Speaker. But this minister is now urging the House to support it, and our relationship with the United States is atrophying. In fact, even NAFTA is at risk under this government, Mr. Speaker. So what I'd like the minister to say is, here is what Canada's national interest is going to be gained. This is what we're going to gain from C-21 and its companion bill, C-23. The minister in his remarks also mentioned human trafficking. And that is an issue that I know concerns both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker. And he tried to suggest that we have to support C-21 if we want to combat human trafficking. A compelling argument, because he knows members of our side. Our former colleague from Manitoba, Joyce Smith, has dedicated most of her life to human trafficking. Mr. Speaker, my colleague from London has hosted some events in relation to this issue, Mr. Speaker. We're concerned about this. So I find it telling that the minister raises the human trafficking reason to get behind C-21, but he didn't defend the national plan to combat human trafficking, Mr. Speaker, which this government let expire in the last budget. So a $20 million plan started by the Harper government to actually combat human trafficking, not just have it held up as a reason to vote for entry-exit information sharing, Mr. Speaker. He has the gall, really, to raise human trafficking in this House as a reason we should get behind this bill. Yet his cabinet, that Prime Minister, let the only national program we have to combat human trafficking expire, Mr. Speaker, not be renewed, even though the problem is worse. You know, it reminds me of the fact that the Prime Minister seems to think Stephen Harper is still the leader of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. He goes out so far as to even cancel programs to combat human trafficking because they originated with the Conservatives. So when someone's being brought into Canada across maybe the U.S. border against their will to be involved in the sex trade or abused in other circumstances, Mr. Speaker, that was the only major program. That was cut largely because it was a Harper initiative, Mr. Speaker. And that's sad. And the minister now suggests we should get behind C-21 because of its potential to combat human trafficking, Mr. Speaker. It's unbelievable. And if you look at the minister's viewpoint with respect to entry and exit going back to when he was in opposition, as I said, there is zero consistency. Zero consistency. In fact, going back to the Safe Third Country Agreement, Mr. Speaker, they said they negotiated it to maintain our international obligations with respect to asylum in conjunction with the Charter, Mr. Speaker. And now they're allowing it to be eroded, and public confidence in it to be eroded by it being circumvented, Mr. Speaker. And suggestions that we apply the spirit and the principle of it to the entire border is mocked, Mr. Speaker, even though the underlying principles with respect to declaring asylum in the first country following persecution, Mr. Speaker, was at the basis of the agreement. So we have a quandary. As you can tell, I've been doing my best to show a bit of the hypocrisy of the minister on this specific issue. But going back to the start of my comments, we actually initiated this under the Conservative government. So this is one time you won't hear the minister referring to the Harper government, Mr. Speaker. They blame the Harper government for anything. If it rains in Canada, that's the Harper government. But now they're basically implementing a Harper government initiative. They're not calling it Beyond the Border, they're calling it C-21, and they won't mention Harper. And they make it sound like it's their own idea, and they're doing it to support human trafficking. And by the way, they're cutting the program on human trafficking. So here's my quandary. I support the bill, but I don't support them, Mr. Speaker. Me neither. Because Canadians can't be trusted. And you just need to look to the record. And I invite Canadians following this debate, do some of the basic research I do, the Open Parliament website. If we printed out the listing for the Liberals' Deputy House Leader, it would fill 18 volumes, Mr. Speaker, of nuggets he's given us over the years showing his inconsistency. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we're trying to get to the heart of this, show the minister that we appreciate he's picking up the Harper mantle on the border when it comes to Beyond the Border initiative. We appreciate that he is starting to understand why trade is important. I'm not sure if the minister was around in the 1988 election when the Liberals ran against U.S. free trade, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad they're coming around to the importance in trade and good relations with the United States. But I would sincerely hope that the next time the minister speaks on Bill C-21, he gives a big thank you to Stephen Harper for this legislation.
I like that idea.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Montarville.
Merci au collègue de Durham, à qui je dis que sa présence au comité nous manque. Et il est dommage qu'il accroche sur l'aspect du trafic humain parce que c'est un exemple parmi tant d'autres. Et là-dessus, j'aimerais l'entendre. N'est-il pas plutôt d'avis que les préoccupations qu'il a soulevées dans sa citation du ministre en 2011, à l'effet que ce sont ces mêmes préoccupations, ces mêmes défis qui a dirigé sa plume maintenant qu'il est dans la chaise du législateur pour justement nous offrir un projet de loi qui soit satisfaisant et qui garantisse toute intervention, quel que soit l'intervenant, que ces interventions-là soient faites sous la protection de la Charte des droits et libertés et donc qui protège toute menace d'intervention à outrance de l'étranger. Merci.
Member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, and I enjoyed my time on the Public Safety Committee with him, or kind of with him, because the government has parliamentary secretaries who kind of sit there and observe, but unfortunately they're not as involved as really they should be. And that member has considerable experience in public safety issues, and that would be appreciated in the discourse. As I said, the Charter of Rights, which grew out of the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights, is something I think all Canadians can be proud of. And it's why the Safe Third Country Agreement, like any type of traffic across the border, including the exit of Canadians under C-21, Mr. Speaker, must respect charter rights. As I said, C-21 and C-23 read together, when you're looking at C-23 is allowing American ICE officials to search, including a body search of Canadians on Canadian soil. These are the most profound two bills on our border that our Parliament has seen. Safe Third Country Agreement handled asylum claims, and I talked about how John Manley and his colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, thought it was appropriate to have a rules-based system. Rules-based system that was consistent, in their words, with the Charter, with the Geneva Convention and international obligations with respect to refugees. And that's what we should all support. What we should be worried about, Mr. Speaker, is when this bill is being introduced under the premise of human trafficking, yet they're cutting the national program to combat human trafficking. This bill is also being premised upon improving the use of the border, while at the same time the government's not even speaking on one page with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement, Mr. Speaker. We need a rules-based system to make sure Canadians maintain confidence in our world-class system.